So in the last tutorial, I showed you how to create a really fast photo scroller for the iPad using blitting techniques. Well, one of the big advantages of that technique is that it ports over to pretty much any other development platform, because every other platform has the concept of a bitmap data of pixels that you can read and write to. And this goes for native Android, native iOS, Windows Phone 7, and also to HTML5. So in this tutorial, we're going to build that same example in HTML5 using the Canvas tag, and you'll be able to see how similar the technique actually is. So I've just created a new directory, and I've reduced the size of all these images to 800 by 600 just so that we can see them easier on my resolution here. And so I just have them in a directory. Now I'm going to be doing this in Dreamweaver CS 5.5, but you can use any text editor that you want, because this is just HTML and JavaScript. But I'm going to create a new, and then I'm going to choose HTML, and then for doc type I'm going to choose HTML5 and click create. This creates just a basic skeleton HTML5 document. So let me just go ahead and save that. I'll just save it as index. So the first thing I'm going to need is that canvas tag that we're going to write our pixels to. So I'll create a new tag, a new canvas tag. I'm going to set the width to 800, the height to 600, and I'm going to give it an ID of canvas. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to need is a slider, which is going to obviously control the strip of photos. So there's a nice new feature in HTML5 in WebKit-based browsers, which is the range input type, which basically gives you a slider. So I'm just going to put in a BR tag here and come underneath, and I'm going to create a new input. Type is going to be range, and I'm going to give it an ID of slider. Now I want to make this span the same width of my canvas, so I'm going to give it a style. So style width 800 pixels. Now we can set the minimum and maximum value. Now remember, we had to do some extra logic in our action script to read that slider that I had created. Well, here we can just set the min and the max to the actual values directly. So min is going to be 0, and max is going to be, basically, since these are 800 pixels wide, it's going to be 800 by 13. Remember, we don't give we only do 13, not 14, because we don't want to scroll that last one past where it should be. So that value pre-calculated comes out to 10,400. Now for the step, I'm going to make a step of 1. This basically just controls how much the values move when you move it, and so creating it nice and smooth at a step of 1. And we'll set the initial value to 0. Oops. Okay, so here's my slider. Now I can go into split view here and show you what that looks like in live view. Here we can see what the slider looks like in WebKit. It's going to look slightly different in Google Chrome, but again, the concept is the same. Now if you were to open this in Firefox or Internet Explorer, this is just going to be a text field. Which still actually works. If you go in and start manipulating values in the text field, it will update the animation. But one thing to note about this live view here in Dreamweaver is the performance of JavaScript is pretty slow. So when I was first building this, I thought I was doing something wrong because it was really sluggish. But once I got out into Google Chrome, it was flying, no problem. So just be aware of that. All right, so I'm going to go back to code view. Now what I want to do is to basically have an init function in my JavaScript that I'm going to call once the once the HTML file has finished loading. So to do that, I'm going to respond to the onLoad event, and I'm going to have it call a function called init. And let me just give this a title here, HTML blit. Okay, so now I'm going to create a script block. And let's go ahead and create that function. So function init. I almost wrote colon void, so we're not doing that here. Takes a little bit of getting used to. Basically, you have to regress a little bit. So what I need to do first when we're dealing with the canvas element, first I want to get a reference to that canvas. So how do we do that? Well, we use the document.getElementById function. And this allows us to pass in a string of which ID we want to get a reference to. So we want to get a reference to canvas, which is the ID that I gave it down there. Okay, so now what we on every canvas element, there's something called the context, and the context is what you actually do all of your drawing and pixel manipulation on. So really, the context is the thing that we want to get. So what I'm going to do is to directly here say get context. Now the type of context we want to get is 2D. If we wanted to do 3D stuff, we could do that. But for here, we're going to put 2D and close this. Now this call right here is going to return the context. So I'm going to have it stored in a variable called context. Now we're going to want to be able to use this anywhere in our JavaScript. So I'm going to define that up here by just saying var context. Okay, so now we have our context to our canvas stored in this variable here. Now when we're dealing with animation in HTML5, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. The simplest is just to use the setInterval method. And we've had this in ActionScript. It's now deprecated. We have the timer class now that does a similar thing. But if we just want to call a function repetitively, we can just say setInterval. And now we put in the function name that we want to call, which I'm going to call loop. And then we put in the amount of delay. Now, this again is in milliseconds. So I'm just going to put in something really fast. We'll put in 10, which would be 100 times a second. So let's go ahead and just create that function now. So this function is going to be called theoretically 100 times a second. Now, one of the things we have to do now is we need to get those images into our script here so that we can actually use them to manipulate. So what I'm going to do is to come under here, and I'm going to create a new array called photos. So I'm going to create a new variable called photos is equal to new array. Now I'm going to create a for loop that's going to go through and add all of those images to that array. So for var I is equal to 0, I is less than 15. Oh, sorry, this should be 1. I made the same mistake in the ActionScript yesterday. And I plus plus. And now what we want to do here is we want to create a new image. So var im is equal to new image. Now we want to set the src property or the source property for that image. So image src. And now we're going to build out what the file name is. So it's p, and then we're going to add I to that, and then we're going to add .jpeg. And lastly, let's go ahead and push that image into our photos array. So photos push im. And this is now going to have all of our images available to us in this photos array. Okay, so now we're ready to actually go to our loop function where we're going to do all of the work. Now, again, we have less work to do here because our slider already has the X position directly just by looking at the value. In the ActionScript, because I had a custom-made slider, we had to figure out the percentage of the slider, multiply that by the total value. But here we can just use this directly. So I'm going to create a variable up here. I'm just going to call it X. And that's just going to hold the X value for us. And it's going to allow us to do our easing. So again, if you looked at the action script from the tutorial yesterday, this is going to be very similar. So I have this variable called x, and actually let me just set it to 0 initially. And all I'm going to do is to come in to do our easing. I'm just going to say x plus equals. Now it's going to be the same thing. We want our destination, where we want it to be scrolled to. Well, that's held in slider.value minus the current position, which is x. And now we're going to multiply that by, let's just do 0.1 at first. And we'll figure that out. We'll adjust that once we actually see it running. Now I'm going to need the very same variables that we had yesterday. We're going to need one called end, which is going to tell us which index of, inside of the photos array that we need to actually blit. And then we're going to need that offset. Because remember, just knowing the photo we need to blit isn't the whole story. We need to figure out which piece of it, and the offset stores that value. So now inside of here I'm going to set end, and this is the same thing we did yesterday. I'm going to do math.floor x divided by 800. Okay, so here we're actually figuring out that x value, and we're dividing it by 800, which is going to tell us which image we actually want to use. And I'm just flooring it off here so that I make sure that it's not doesn't have a decimal number. Okay, now we need to calculate the offset, same as yesterday. Offset is equal to x mod 800. And that tells us what's the remainder after we divide x by 800. And lastly, we just have our two calls to copy pixels. Now, it's not called copy pixels in HTML5, but it's the same exact concept. And we're going to be using the context rather than bitmap data. But once you have the context of a canvas element, you can think of that context as the bitmap data class. So I'm going to call the draw image method on the context. And first we're going to provide what image do we want to draw. So we want to draw photos end. And now there's a set of parameters that we have to set, and there's basically 8 parameters. That's the source x, source y, source width, source height, and the same thing for the destination. So let's go ahead and set that. So for the source x, it's going to be offset, which is going to tell us where to start copying the pixels from. For y, it's going to be 0. And these are the same things that we set yesterday. For the source width, we basically want 800 minus offset. It's always going to be 600. Now we're in the destination properties. Destination x is always going to be 0, 0 for that first image. And destination width is going to be 800 minus offset, and then 600. And again, this is the same exact thing we did with the copy pixels call in the action script. Now here I'm going to create a second one, and this is going to be for the image. This is going to be for the image after that first one. Okay, so what I have to do here is now just to say in plus 1, and now this one is always, for the source x, is always going to be 0. The source y is always going to be 0. For the width and the height, we can just use 800 by 600. It's not going to matter here. If we wanted to, we could actually only select the number of pixels that were appropriate. It's not really going to matter. Here I'm going to say 800 minus offset, and that's going to be where in the context we're going to be placing. So this is the destination x property. Destination y, again, is always going to be 0. And for the destination width and height, we just, again, do 800 by 600. They're going to be cut off slightly, because it's not going to be shown in the canvas, but that's fine. So this is basically all we have to do here to get this to work. And again, it's very simple code and very similar to the code we had in ActionScript. And it's made slightly easier just by the fact that our slider down here allows us to directly set the min and max to these values. So let's go ahead and test this now. And let me launch up Chrome. And here we have our first image, and here we have our slider. And now you can see we get really nice fast performance here. Now I can actually change this value. Let's drop it even to 1 here and see if that changes things. Now, with all of my tutorials, you need to remember that I'm recording at 15 frames per second here. So you're not going to see just how smooth this is until you actually look at the example live. If you go to my blog, on the blog post, I'll have a link to this running live in the browser. But definitely I recommend for you to build it yourself. And you can really get a sense of how good the performance is here. So again, that's a very simple example of how you would do this same type of blitting in HTML5. Now these same concepts, again, are going to apply to basically any other development platform out there. And that's one of the advantages of doing things when you can using blitting techniques. Now, I'm going to be doing a blog post that's going to talk about when you would want to blit, when you would not want to blit, and things are definitely going to be changing in the near future when we have Molehill or Stage 3D available on mobile, because then basically everything will be in concept blitted for you without you having to even do any of this stuff. So that's the basics of doing HTML5 blitting using the canvas tag.